Hello and welcome. So far in week one, we've been thinking about what we've been doing so far at our schools or agencies with the standards, and we've reviewed the standards themselves with a scavenger hunt. Now let's take some time to work with, both through this video and through the handout you downloaded, the task of unpacking the college and career readiness standards. So what is the role of standards? What role can clearly articulated standards play in improving student achievement? First, let's just remember that standards are not new to education or even adult education. In 1992, we had the model standards. It's easy just to think of the CCRS now as the new model standards. So let's get back to our question. Having standards, though, really is not enough to improve student achievement. Standards are intended to guide teachers in addressing key skills and content that students need in order to succeed. However, completely understanding these standards is one of the ways teachers can fully implement them in the classroom. You really need to understand them first. And one way to fully understand them is to require that we unpack them. So let's talk about that. What does it mean to unpack standards? Here's a definition. To unpack standards means to do a close reading of the standards and, using evidence from them, to be able to determine what students need to know and be able to do to meet the demands of that standard. So what's the value of this work of unpacking the standards? Well, again, standards-based education is not new. It's something that we found important for decades. Again, using standards will guide teachers to develop lessons and activities to measure whether students are meeting these expectations of these standards. We know that the CCRS are complex. In order to determine what the individual standards require of learners, teachers can unpack them in order to address each individual component of the standards. Often, standards have multiple components. These help to convey what is intended for each standard, and we'll look really closely at these components in just a moment. The value of unpacking standards is having a clear understanding of what the standard requires students to be able to do, and, in turn, being able to plan clear and accurate instruction that really focuses our work and helps to support students in achieving these expectations. And finally, when we unpack these standards and begin applying them as a group of teachers, possibly in a professional learning community, it really helps support the work of the community for our students. So we talked earlier about the different components of the standard, and the question is, what's in a standard? Well, there are three parts. The first are skills, the second are concepts, and the third are context. And that asterisk means that not every standard has a context. We'll talk about that. Let's look at some definitions of these terms. What are skills? Well, skills are actions that learners are expected to do to demonstrate mastery. Examples include using a reading strategy, composing an argumentative essay. Skills. Second, what was it? Concepts. Concepts are information or ideas that learners are expected to know. Examples would include main ideas, themes, elements of writing, and finally, context. The third piece is the situations where learners apply the understanding of these concepts and the mastery of the skills. This could be digital sources, listening to a speaker, online, just where are the students gaining the learning and applying their skills? Skills, concepts, context. Let's look at skills first in more detail. Skills are really represented in the standards by a verb or a verb phrase. So when we're trying to find skills, we isolate those verbs. They indicate what learners are expected to do to demonstrate mastery, and they really do determine the level of thinking required by the learners. So let's look at an example of one skill. And this is the reading strand anchor standard 2. The overarching anchor standard is, you can see in the blue box at the bottom, determine central ideas or themes of a text and analyze their development. Summarize the key supporting details and ideas. Well, for now, we're going to look at the reading strand anchor 2, but level B. We know that there are levels A through E. Let's focus on level B. This one says, determine the main idea of a text, recount the key details, and explain how they support the main idea. Now, as I go through and pull out these 3 different elements, skills, concepts, and context, I'll model it, and then later in the video, I'll give you some time to try and do it on your own with me as we go together. So what are the skills? Well, we're looking for verbs. So determine, recount, and what's the last one? Explain. Okay, so students need to determine things, they need to recount and explain them. Let's look at concepts. As opposed to skills with verbs, concepts usually use nouns or noun phrases in the standard. These are the information or the big ideas that learners need to know. Let's look at an example. But first, let's remember, I think this is important. The key fact is that concepts can be repeated over many levels or over years, such as the life cycle, or growth and development, or main idea. But it's the skills or the verbs that are going to increase the rigor and or level of the thinking required. And this we'll talk about more later in our module together. So let's look at finding the concepts in that earlier standard. We're going to stay with this as we look at each of the 3 parts. We've got the verbs already, and I want to call out that it's great to annotate with different colors or different symbols. You can see verbs I have circled in blue. I'm going to do something different. I'm going to underline the nouns that we find for concepts. So determine what? The main idea. Recount what? The key details. All right, so usually you have a noun following the verb. Okay? All right, let's talk about context. Now remember I said that it's not always included in every standard, and this is sometimes because it's self-evident. If you're talking about um, um, an article, it's going to be text, so it's not called out in the standard. But the context is indicates what the context is or the learning stimulus in which learners are required to use the standard skills and concepts. And here's an example. Draw information from digital sources. Summarize key points a speaker makes. And I will add that usually the context is a prepositional phrase, and you can see one example here, from digital sources. Let's see if we can find these in that reading standard. Again, we circled the verbs, we underlined the concepts or nouns, and now we're going to look at the context. Where are students doing this work of determining main ideas? Where are they recounting the key details? Well, if you use that hint I said, prepositional phrase, determine the main idea of a text. And I'm going to dash and under those words with red color. So they're determining the main idea not from a speech, but from a text. And some people might say that you also have the context of supporting the main idea when you're finding the key details and explaining them why, in what context, to support the main idea. That's context. All right. Another way of looking at this work of unpacking the standards is through this chart. You can see that we have the 3 categories: skills, concepts, context, and you can see again the skills are determine, recount, explain, concepts what, main idea, key details, and key details as support for a main idea. And this is all within the context of text. All right, so that's my modeling. Before we work together on another standard, we need to answer this question. Why do this? What does this mean for instruction in this unpacking? Well, it means a lot of things, and let's talk about that briefly. You have to make an instructional decision Once you unpack a standard, you need to decide if you're going to focus on just one component, just a skill, a concept, or a context, or just one of each of those, or if you're going to put it all together, teach all those components. So, question, what factors might influence your decision about how to work with a standard? When might you want to just choose an individual component versus putting them all together? Because we know it's harder when we put them all together. All right, well, we're talking about scaffolding. And some things you might keep in mind is obviously the student's level. You want to be aware of their previous learning in your class and consider what point in the term are you? Are you at the beginning, the middle, or the end? So probably at the beginning, you keep it simpler and focus on an individual component. Whereas towards the end, you may have been building up. Students have more practice and more confidence and skill. You can teach all the components together. Unpacking the standards in this way will really help you design appropriate activities, assignments, and assessments. Unpacking the standards makes your expectations clear. And adult students we know from adult learning theory want that. And it makes our job easier as well. This is really in line too with backwards design. So if you're familiar with that, you know that this sounds familiar. Backwards design is a method of designing our educational curriculum by setting goals before choosing the methods and forms of assessment. We need to know where we're headed, and then we can figure out how to get there. And we'll focus more on activities, assignments, and assessments later in this module when we look at Webb's depth of knowledge. Yeah, that's coming up too. For right now, let's focus on the process of unpacking by trying to unpack another standard together. This time, we're going to be looking at a standard from the writing strand, and this is Anchor Standard 6. Notice it's level D, a little higher. The overarching standard, the anchor standard, is the same in the blue box as it is above. Use technology, including the internet, to produce and publish writing, and link to and cite sources, as well as to interact and collaborate with others. So you can see that there's a lot going on there. So let's work together to unpack it. I'm going to ask you first to look for the verbs, or what? The skills. What are the skills students need to be able to master? Okay, so where are the verbs? I'll give you a moment to think about that. And imagination, in your imagination or in real life, create circles around those verbs. Okay, what are they? See if I don't give away too much. Good. Yeah, there's a lot. There's 7 of them. You're going to use some kind of resource. You're going to produce and publish something, link to and cite stuff, and interact and collaborate. Yeah, 7 different skills. So like we talked about just now, you might not want to do all of those in the first go around with the standard, right? So those are our skills. What's next? The concepts. And how do we designate, how are those designated? Yes, through the nouns, and you might want to underline those. So what would you underline? Use what? Go ahead and determine what you would underline to unpack the standard. That's right. Usually the nouns follow the verb. So you're going to use technology, produce and publish writing, and link to and cite sources. All right. So what's left? Context. Is there a context for this standard, for this work, these skills and concepts that students are going to be working with? Well, yes. Where are they doing the using of the technology? Well, it's going to be on the internet. And where are they going to interact and collaborate? With others. All right. So those are the context. And those really are big, broad ideas to help really us understand where students are going to be working and how are they going to be working. So that is a writing anchor standard, a little more complex. What differences do you see between this standard and the previous? Yeah, you may remember that the first reading standard was level B, simpler, shorter, and this one is level D. It's at the higher end, so it's going to have a greater demand on the learners. All right, so we finished with the video here, and before you go, let's just talk about what's next. You have a handout that you downloaded from the Moodle page for this activity. There are 5 standards on the handout for you to unpack. So do that. Once you've downloaded it, you're going to type into the Word document, and then when you're finished with each of those standards, you're going to submit it back to Moodle, and you'll simply click on the Add Submission link button in Moodle. Good luck, and I'll see you in week 2. Looking forward to seeing your work.